So, how can the critical humanities help us address these complex and intertwined dynamics that are shaping our present? And what better place to think about alternative futures than Beirut, where the future keeps increasingly looking more like the past, if not worse? So futures past is a kind of a term that is coined by Reinhard Koselleck, the philosopher of history. And futures past as a phrasing kind of carries a strange sense of, or a tense of a future anterior. So almost kind of a future that is behind us somehow. Reinhard Koselleck described modernity as the accelerated temporality within which all our horizons of expectation become more and more narrow. There is a kind of a collapsing of distance between our expectations and our experiences in modernity. In other words, we increasingly consider our futures in the ways we have already imagined them in the past. So progress is accelerating towards ends that we somehow can already foresee and predict. And this condition in this account, or the modern condition, is a condition of being haunted by imagined futures in the past, whereby the future is more of a haunting specter from the past than a possibility of something different. So our present conditions of crisis increasingly look like scenes out of a movie we have watched: dystopias, apocalyptic endings, imminent catastrophes, ecological wastelands, the ruins of civilization as civilization. I think our first speaker, Alenka Zupancic, spent quite some time engaging with this problem, and Françoise Vergès also in her lecture did the same. So the speakers in the series that we have invited are invited to address this kind of uncanny temporality, and perhaps Professor Cole will come to this from the question of space and spatiality. More crucially, they're invited to do so from Beirut in Lebanon, with the hope that what is happening here in our current context does not really become the future past of the world. So from this context that we're in, we urgently see the need for futures other than those that have passed. So we're pleased to host today Professor Andrew Cole, who is the Woodrow Wilson Professor of Literature and the director of the Gauss Seminar Series at Princeton. He was a Guggenheim Fellow in 2014, a visiting fellow at All Souls College at the University of Oxford in 2010, a Bloomfield Fellow at Harvard University, the Clark Lecturer at Trinity College, Cambridge University, and visiting professor at the Society for Criticism and Theory at Cornell University. Andrew is a critical theorist and a medieval scholar. His work covers an astounding range of sources, theoretically and historically. He is the author of Literature and Heresy in the Age of Chaucer, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2010. He is the co-editor of The Legitimacy of the Middle Ages on the Unwritten History of Theory with Duke University Press in 2010. He co-edited the Cambridge Companion to Piers Plowman, which is, I guess, concerned with alliterations, allegory, satire, all the interesting things that, yes, and social crisis. So Andrew's most recent book, The Birth of Theory, is particularly intriguing and original. In it, he proposes that Hegel returns in his philosophy to pre-modern dialectics in order to expose the persistence of the pre-modern and the modern condition. And he argues that this move is a site of birth of theory, in contrast to, I guess, a more systematic philosophy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Cole. Very much looking forward to this.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see you all here. Thank you for coming out on a Friday, no less, at 5 p.m. I will try to make this interesting. I will talk for an hour. I will have a timer on, so when the timer beeps, you can start to feel good about things. That means I will try to wrap up. This is my first time visiting Lebanon. This is my first time in Beirut, and I just wanted to sort of mark that significance now, in the sense of when I initially received the invitation from Nadia, I couldn't have been more eager and enthusiastic to say yes immediately and to come. It turns out I'm finishing a volume that's the sequel to The Birth of Theory, and it's primarily about space. And I've had time to reflect on how certain elements of thought that either has affiliation with the university here or scholars who are Lebanese scholars working, the influence that has had on my own work. And I would just like to name those individuals. So Walid Khalidi, the book All That Remains, I know that he had affiliation with the university here for a couple of decades. He had affiliation with my university for a couple of decades. That work, all that remains, the Palestinian villages occupied and depopulated by Israel in 1948, has been very instrumental in my thinking, especially in the epilogue, where I'm curious about how different aesthetic forms, different media enable the thought of space in a different kind of way. So thinking space linguistically is different from gesturing or inhabiting or moving your body through space, for instance, just to take one example. And the notion of a field study, the notion of talking to elders, the notion of doing archaeological excavation, the notion of being there, which is a different kind of Dasein, for me was very influential and kind of unlocked a lot of what I wanted to think, connecting Hegel to the moment that is contemporary. I don't know if this individual is here, so I don't mean to embarrass you, but if there is a one Mona Fawaz here, your thinking has also been important to me in the relationship between abstract forms of spatial thinking in relationship to cognitive thinking and technologies for spatial thinking that we know as GPS software. And the story, case study of a delivery driver named Ziad, who is quoted as saying, "I have a GPS, but in my memory." Mona and her, if I may, and her co-authors go on to say that as Ziad continues his description, it is evident that 3 years of working on the job have enriched his navigation skills beyond those of a regular GPS system. I find that a very, very interesting suggestion, and it's something exactly what I'm looking for at a moment when technologies take over the process of thought for us. At the moment where who remembers a phone number anymore? They're all in your cell phone, right? Who knows how to really cognitively map? GPS software does a great job of that. We don't need to think space anymore. I find that a very curious tension. I find it a very intriguing atrophy of certain spatial faculties that we have cognitively. And I just wanted to say a word of thanks for that contribution to scholarship too. And then finally, there is an American Lebanese author named Anthony Shadid, who has a book called The Stone House, and it's about trying to recover his maternal grandfather's house that was destroyed in southern Lebanon, and he wants to go there. It's this kind of like really kind of crazy story about multiple stonemasons coming in, finding things hidden in the walls, and just also a recount of less than space, but more about place and dwelling and the meaning of place and locality, and how can that be recovered, how that can be reconstructed. There too are interesting proposals about the relationship between, again, as I will talk about here and repeat kind of ad nauseum, how certain media produce a different kind or thought about space. His interesting contribution is about space and accenting, that there at different locations, there are different people speak different accents, which is a particularization of language I find useful versus the generality of language as a structure, as a universal, et cetera, as something that's the subject of linguistics, say, right? And so this would sort of it's a sort of like a reverse Derrida, prioritizing speech over language, okay? So I just wanted to make those things clear, and it's really wonderful to sort of think with these authors. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to be with you. So again, when I say thank you for coming on a Friday, I really do mean it. So reaching for my timer, I will start in on a talk called Asymmetries. Asymmetry names several different problems ranging from the social to the political to the natural to the metaphysical. We often hear the term in reporting about asymmetrical warfare or in discussions about economic or educational inequalities, of the uneven distribution of wealth and resources, of how many individuals labor the hardest for how long, depleting their bodies for wages that are unlivable, unsustainable. Asymmetry, it seems, evokes matters of inequality in a distinctly spatial way. the manner in which asymmetry invites one to picture or even visualize in an illustration, say, proportions relative to others. Asymmetry, this is to say, involves several modes of aesthesis, different kinds of experiencing, and accordingly enters into the academic disciplines in ways that are themselves asymmetrical in institutions of higher learning that are disproportionately skewed toward the study of the safe and the same, if not at the level of primary education in my country, the study of the false, or in the case of my own country again, of pseudo-national histories of slavery, of whitewashed histories of terror against Black folk that are whitewashed for the sake of a quote unquote fair and balanced presentation in the TV news. In a stricter disciplinary sense, in say the discipline of architecture, to continue on with our spatial theme, asymmetry concerns design or structural elements that do not mirror one another, but can achieve visual balance and the right disparity of volumes, thus expressing a certain dynamism between elements, a more alive design that isn't inert seeming or rotely repetitious. More at the level of the everyday, our built environment, the terrain on which it is grounded is through and through uneven and asymmetrical, from soil compositions to elevations that we level and terraform in our constructions and desire for levelness, smooth plains, and surfaces, a desire all the more acute when there is unevenness under our feet. And so we still walk or otherwise locomote across terrains that strain our legs or, as abilities vary, strain our arms, experiencing an embodied relationship to underlying asymmetries in place that are fashioned by whomever built our world, shaping our perceptions and indeed our lives through deep and not so deep infrastructures often put into place from generations on end, or for that matter, imposed by occupying forces and settlers. There isn't a place in the world where asymmetry doesn't matter, which is why in the case of climate science, it's necessary to formulate non-linear mathematical models to try and discern the relation between inputs and outputs that will produce unpredictable and asymmetrical impacts across the globe that fall and will continue to fall along lines of economic class, race, and region. But why stop here in this thought of asymmetry? Why stay at the level of the planetary? You're free to raise this problem to the cosmos. How dare we not reach or dream and contemplate with the disciplines of particle physics the asymmetry between matter and antimatter, between, that is, baryonic and antibaryonic matter, there being more matter than antimatter, as well as more neutrinos than antineutrinos in the universe as we currently know it. This particular asymmetry, far below our noses, in which matter prevails, explains why there exists anything at all, though of course we may never answer what came before. Clearly and perhaps breathlessly, the fact of asymmetry intrigues me, and in a more boring way, it fascinates me because it connects many disciplinary practices in critical theory, philosophy, intellectual history, empirical sciences, the arts, the study of human culture, and the praxis necessary to help and heal ourselves, if not our world. Now, coming off of that, I would like to make this deflationary claim that asymmetry intrigued the philosopher Hegel like no other thinker. And this is revealed in the very construction of his dialectic as an inherently spatialized logic that helps us first name these asymmetries, then think them, and then make a politics out of them. Now, whether we can call all of these aforementioned asymmetries in my overture dialectical, that's one thing, and results may vary. But what can be said is that Hegel's dialectic is the preeminent form and exemplary logic of asymmetry. Hegel examines asymmetries across the staggering range of his work on architecture, sculpture, painting, music, poetry, history, politics, natural science, religion, and philosophy. And in fact, his understanding of contradiction is itself a signal instance of asymmetrical relationality, whereby opposition, that sort of binary opposition, is never even Steven, never as we say, six of one and half dozen of another, never perfectly opposed polarities, but always a lopsided and uneven affair. Hegel's Lord Bondsman or so-called master-slave dialectic is just one example of this asymmetry. Asymmetry itself is not exactly a term Hegel repeats a lot, so much as he criticizes symmetry and enjoys speaking of symmetries that are only symmetries in name, as if almost in a game of gotcha, chuckling every time a symmetry, that is, a symmetry, falls apart. We can observe, above all, that Hegel decided that symmetry and asymmetry has most to do with architectures and questions of the built environment. Take his aesthetics, for instance. Hegel establishes architecture as primarily or ideally an art of symmetry, or more specifically, the relations of symmetry among masses and volumes. But in saying so, he set himself up for the task of showing how a given symmetry undoes itself in both architectural design and in the dynamic between architecture and other arts that support architecture, like sculpture, and indeed in the tensions between architecture and habitation, or architecture and use, or theory and practice, and generally between architecture and this thing we call life. Art, in fact, for Hegel is ever in tension with symmetry and seeks to escape it, even if at moments it falls back into symmetry, which is why he says that, quote, the ideal work of art must rise above the purely symmetrical. So it's not art if it's symmetrical. In terms of architecture in Hegel, we find that the more architecture there is, the more building there is, the more that symmetry comes under strain as the built environment accumulates into a more complex and embroidered totality, open to unpredictable, unintended, and undesigned kinds of relationality involving a range of practices and purposes, like sculpture and the other arts like music, painting, and poetry. How can we think a spatial dialectic in these terms and not bother ourselves so much with the familiar dialectic of so many garden variety philosophies of history that hasten you on from thing to thing? In other words, how can we think a spatial dialectic instead of the dialectic that we're used to thinking, which is the temporal dialectic, the dialectic where you just kind of wait around, bide your time, and then stuff happens? Hegel mostly talks about symmetry as a process of emergent asymmetry, or an Auflösung, a dissolution of symmetry into asymmetry, demonstrating the limits of symmetry and the undoing of symmetry in relation to what's built or what's embodied, what's constructed and what's extensive. And so to my mind, this means that he aims to represent or even figure dialectics in an especially capacious way. Figure dialectics in the sense of those moments where he wants to make his dialectical thinking clear by other means than just saying, I'm doing dialectics. So for example, very much within his writing, he speaks about the shapes or Gestalten of the dialectic, which I believe is a spatializing gesture on his part. There are many examples like this that challenge our habits to think of the dialectic in only temporal or even linguistic terms. The problem, in other words, is not that you do dialectics and for your misdeeds take careful notes on an excruciating line of thinking in such complex texts like the Phenomenology of Spirit. Rather, it's that you step away from texts, step away from timelines, quit logophilia to instead see, feel, sense, and touch what is inherently concrete and contradictory about our world as a built environment, and ponder how we can develop a corresponding theory of place, a dialectic of space. So this section is called Cities. Now, a dialectic of space worth its weight must account for the problems, struggles, contestations, erasures, and indeed asymmetries of the built environment. And so we will work our way to these problems by asking what it means to represent the built environment at all, how narration, or rather language, picks out space and place, how it brings into reference infrastructures and structures, and how in the discipline of literature or the literary arts, the novel form emerges as a potentially privileged genre insofar as it is a registration device for spatiality itself. Here I am thinking of the novel as a technology of space, if you will, that indexes the built environment rather than only indexing time. I begin with the Nigerian-American author Teju Cole, a thinker, no relation by the way, but a thinker keenly attentive to social and economic asymmetries and the problem of race, space, migration, and the crossing of borders. Teju Cole's Open City, a novel published in 2011, follows Julius, a Nigerian immigrant in his final year of his psychiatry fellowship, sauntering around New York City in the mode of a classic nightly constitutional, or in other words, walking therapy, seeking to get out for some fresh air and to clear his head from his daily cares. He moves with varying degrees of attentiveness, perception, and involvement in his surroundings, and calls his perambulations aimless wandering. Much of what I was doing downtown, by the way. In the following quotation, and this is the first one on the handout, which purportedly exists. But this is the first quotation if folks want to share or just sit back and relax, and I'll try to read it out in story time fashion. We will join Julius at a particular place in the novel. After hanging out at the intersection of Albany and Washington Streets in Lower Manhattan, he finds his way onto Vesey Street, pressed on by a crushing crowd of professionals leaving work. Going with the human flow, he comes upon the location of the former World Trade Center buildings after the event of September 11, 2001. He looks down into the enormous empty pit that he names a construction site and shares these thoughts. And now finally, this is the handout. This was not the first erasure on this site, quoting Teju Cole now. Before the towers had gone up, there had been a bustling network of little streets traversing this part of town. Robinson Street, Lawrence Street, College Place. All of them had been obliterated in the 1960s to make way for the World Trade Center buildings, and were all forgotten now. Gone too was the old Washington Market, the active piers, the fishwives, the Christian Syrian enclave that was established here in the late 1800s. The Syrians, the Lebanese, and other people from the Levant had been pushed across the river to Brooklyn, where they'd set down roots on Atlantic Avenue and in Brooklyn Heights. And before that, what Lenape paths, these are Amerindians, these are indigenous folk who lived in the region, what Lenape paths lay buried beneath the rubble? The site was a palimpsest, and palimpsest is going to be a word I'm going to do something with here in a minute. The site was a palimpsest, as was all the city, written, erased, rewritten. There had been communities here before Columbus ever set sail, before Verrazano anchored his ships in the Narrows, or the black Portuguese slave trader Esteban Gomez sailed up the Hudson. Human beings had lived here, built homes, and quarreled with their neighbors long before the Dutch ever saw a business opportunity in the rich furs and timber of the island and its calm bay. Generations rushed through the eye of the needle, and I, one of the still legible crowd, entered the subway. I wanted to find the line that connected me to my own part in these stories. So here's me again. Seeing past constructions and destruction, discovering quite how many memories are contained in what's erased as something else, as something new is being raised, or being erected, being constructed, the so-called Freedom Tower that stands now in downtown New York City. Julius contemplates accumulations of histories, any one of which could take a lifetime to know well or study. There's a single image in this passage that captures a multiplicity here on Vesey Street, and that's the image of the palimpsest. The site was a palimpsest, as was all the city, written, erased, rewritten, unquote. The palimpsest is a very easy textual metaphor, and in other work I have cautioned against such metaphoricity in cases where it leads to the hasty textualization of space, rendering the spatial and the material into a linguistic and temporal form in the face of its hard and intransigent materiality that concretizes the past in a very persistent way. In other words, the medium matters here. When we remember that the very idea or problem of the palimpsest comes not from the age of linguistics, lexicography, and universal grammars, nor from the suburban American moment of three-hole punch notebook paper for your groovy Mead trapper-keeper. Rather, the palimpsest results from the practices of writing on surfaces like stone and dried animal skin on which someone has already written, and whose text, whose work you erase through manual pressure, through the violence of taking a chisel or a blade to the material itself to scrape away the writing and overlay your own. But you can only do so much erasing and rewriting without destroying the writing surface itself. The idea being that the underlying matter can only take so much digging in or erasure. Put in these material terms, the medium is not a hard drive on your computer because it resists overwriting. The palimpsest pushes back until it gives in, which means that the medium typically preserves what's erased, even if only as a faint, illegible trace, in what I think is an example of Hegelian sublation or Aufhebung. There's a whole footnote here about Aufhebung in relationship to architecture. If you want to hear about that, just ask me. What's passed as old writing is very much present, very much there in the material. It's a notion of the past that is not as some idea you vaguely entertain about history or a factoid you read in a printed history book, but rather to amplify Teju Cole's point, it's history or the past as an accretion in the built environment itself, and what can be named, and what I would like to name after Hegel, a material contradiction. So that's one of the things that interests me. So, you know, if you just want to write words down, we got palimpsest, we have material contradiction, and we can just leave it at that, right? We're done. That's it. The term material contradiction can be helpful in recognizing the material dynamics and torsions between what lies beneath and what gets dignified by the term surface and what gets demeaned by the term depth, and all that is presented to us as appearance. Every city expresses these material contradictions, and it doesn't take the destruction of a building to think them, or in the meaning of aesthetics offered by Freud in his essay on the uncanny, to feel them. Instead, it takes many things, many approaches, many feelings, addressing the total sensorium and all that falls under aesthesis. So more on that point as we move along. Meanwhile, let me approach the problem of thinking or representing a city in another way, this time looking at a passage that doesn't overtly portray a site as a palimpsest, but implies such a construction in any case in its depiction of a city space more generally. I am thinking of Haruki Murakami's novel 1984, which on the cover is printed as 1Q84, published in 2009. Now we're in Tokyo, Japan. Early in the novel, we find the main character, Aomame, as she abruptly exits a taxi and descends a precarious emergency staircase, going from a congested elevated highway to the street level in the city. She pauses and experiences her surroundings in the following all-encompassing way. And this should be the second quote on your handout, I think. The din of the city enveloped her. Car engines, blaring horns, the scream of an automobile burglar alarm, an old war song echoing from a right-wing sound truck, a sledgehammer cracking concrete. Riding on the wind, the noise pressed in on her from all directions. Okay, that's end of the quote. So the thing about this passage is that everything goes together so expectedly, so naturally, everything retailed with equal force, with every oral element said to affect Aomami from all directions. I mean, this is like what you see in novels. Like you read a novel, you see this, you read this. This is what is, right? Oh, it's a city. This passage reads not like a palimpsest so much as maybe a noise collage. It's an oral surface, that is to say. It is not a dimensionalized oral word image of the city, because there is no verbal sense of any sound or noise being closer or farther than the other, louder or quieter, ranging in this or that frequency. Words work here. Again, words do their work here, yet they fail, yet they don't work. Language succeeds by failing, if you'd rather think of it that way. It's all here, registering what it takes not only to figure somehow the built environment where space plus language reduces language to enumeration and indices, the sheer listing of details. Rather, it is also a passage that invites us to question its very possibility. Like, how can you write a sentence like that? Just what are the conditions of possibility for writing a sentence like that? What we have here in this catalog of noise, in other words, is an allusion to complex historical processes and likewise an accumulation of pasts. Each item listed in this passage presupposes whole histories of technology, equipment, transportation, politics, war, infrastructure, materials, science, and, as the common denominator, capitalist progress. Most of these developments happen by accident, by fits and starts, by interlocking intentions, by someone's plan A meeting someone's plan B, by competing copyrights and patents, by diverse approaches to production, all in totality that no single person could witness, no single sentence could capture, much less a single word like city or den could convey. If centuries of historicism have taught us anything, it's that writing and history, sentences and events are never a perfect match. And city novels intensify this problem of representation because they are sites for a language practice that is thoroughly conventional, as in this example, yet rather unbelievable when you really start to reflect on all that needs to happen in time, history, and place for a simple sentence like that one to be imagined and then legible. The passage in Murakami, in other words, gets at this idea or even problem that the city, as an intensified and layered example of the very meaning of the built environment, is a haphazard accumulation of praxes, erasures of praxes, and immense complexes of material forces drawn into a mass whose shape and dynamics no one can completely know in advance or describe at any given moment using whatever linguistic means are at their disposal. Even planned cities exceed their plan in this respect, and always famously they do. And of course, what's now known as world cities are so extensive and unbounded as to escape comprehension and visualization. All of these accidents of history and human habitation add up to a sum, an accumulation, greater than the individual parts. Yet here we have our breezy, novelistic sentence by Murakami where everything just goes together and you read on. It's curious that you can find this problem of representation in most of the great so-called city novels, with, say, Eugène Sue's Les Mystères de Paris of 1842 to 43, extending all the way to Murakami's 1984. Novels which are almost always 1,000 pages long or more, and yet still in their portrayal, they come up short in their depiction of urban space, only to be able to depict the city metonymically and serially by parts like the rooftops, the noise, the street, and so forth. But the problem isn't only about cities or long novels, even if we should view the city as an intensification of problems of the built environment seen everywhere else. If you think, for example, of Sarah Broom's lovely novel published in 2019, The Yellow House, you quickly find that the problem of language persists at a very local level, where in a new kind of poetics of space, You can only dream about touching your former devastated house. The eponymous yellow house in an African-American neighborhood utterly wrecked by the hurricane named Katrina. You can only have dreams of knocking on the door of the destroyed house, feeling in your dreams the material resistance of the door on your knuckles, which makes the problem of writing about the house rather an interesting proposition when words don't seem to be enough. The author, Sarah Broom, writes, and this is the third quotation, "Daryl's house of 5 children made me think of the yellow house. During the night, I dreamt of it for the first time in 5 years. I was at the locked front door attempting to bang it down. Bam, bam, bam was the sound I made, but it didn't yield. In the dream, the weight of the door hurt my hand too much to keep going. The next morning, I woke exhausted and wrote the following in my notebook: How to resurrect a house with words." End quote. Within the space of Daryl's house, Sarah wakes up to write about how hard it is to write, realizing that this house is materialized now only in a dream. Sound, gravity, heaviness, weight, the unyielding door, physical pain, all of which comes first and ends in the question how to resurrect a house with words. Yes, there are words here, but words yearning for other ways to access this space, this old space, this destroyed space, this former house, using other media and other modes. To speak of media is to take some fundamental insights from media theory. It is to propose that this very problem of representation could be specified as an asymmetry between different media, a contradiction between language and what's not language, and all that counts as the nonverbal, solidified, materialized, concretized facticities of human habitation, or what Jean-Paul Sartre would call in his critique of dialectical reason, the practico-inert. By this phrase, the practico-inert, Sartre means the sedimented praxis of our surroundings that we confront in our daily routines and which constrain our activities. For example, you have to wait in line for the bus this way if the bus ever arrives. You have to walk down the alley that way, but around this pothole or tree. Why is this wall here? And who pitched the steps so steeply, and so forth? Turns out the existentialist framework applies not only to people getting in your face and hellishly interfering with your own quote unquote project, as Sartre calls it, it also applies to people in the past doing the same thing with the structures they built and left behind for you to encounter, negotiate, and confront. What's the point? It's that space isn't only a problem of language, even if it's a problem for language. There is a full sensorium involved, and the analysis of space demands something more of us. It requires that we not so hastily transform space into language as if language and space are adequate to one another, even if it is deeply curious that the failure of language itself is often spatialized as a gap in the symbolic or the eruption of the real, like some mythical leviathan breaking the surface of the symbolic. Or even if, I may go on to say, that it's doubly curious that for Derrida, spacing marks the moment of a new era of legibility for text. All of this means, too, if there's a way to make a problem even more grandiose, that we must not temporalize space, as if space and time are the same and interchangeable and thus somehow equally absolute as Francis Newton mistakenly believed. They are not even in space-time. The problem is to approach space through a variety of media, some better adapted to spatiality than others. If there is a point to even talking about the range of media at our disposal in spatial analysis, it's to say that each form or mode presupposes a kind of relating to space that is necessarily distinct from another medium. That thinking space with language is different from thinking space with images or with dreams or with your body or with whatever ability, or even just moving through place. There are too many contradictions in space and place to rely on just one mode, one approach. This section is called heterotopia. What Teju Cole and Haruki Murakami are exemplifying, what they are showing us in their descriptions of New York City and Tokyo, respectively, is perhaps a notion of heterotopia, which is often a term you hear to characterize urban spaces as contradictory and multiply determined, as historically sedimented, and as accretions of human praxes. Andreas Huysen, in his book Present Past, kind of interesting cut across the theme, in his book Present Past, writes that, quote, the strong marks of present space merge in the imaginary with traces of the past, erasures, losses, and heterotopias. Just let that float. We won't really worry about that one so much. It's the notion of heterotopia that we're after. Even earlier, Michel Foucault, in his venturing into spatial conceptions, in a well-known lecture called Of Other Spaces, which he wished was not circulated, proffered an idea of heterotopia that is, in his words, quote, capable of juxtaposing in a single real place several spaces, several sites that are in themselves incompatible, unquote. Foucault's formulation initially seems like a promising line of inquiry that can help us say something else, maybe something more about Teju Cole's palimpsest that is New York City. Furthermore, it seems promising when Foucault boldly declares that, quote, the present epoch will perhaps above all be the epoch of space. We are in the epoch of simultaneity. We are in the epoch of juxtaposition, the epoch of the near and far, of the side by side, of the dispersed, unquote. But I have to say there's a modicum, a small amount of disappointment in Foucault, or in Foucauldianism, circling around the problem of built environments. To begin with, Foucault wants to preserve his idea of the site in the discursive sense as what is produced by institutions and as what disciplines subjects within regimes of power. In other words, he aims to separate the analysis of discursive or institutional sites from the material sense of a site as a place. And he does this even while at the very moment he's developing his tantalizingly entitled Archaeology of Knowledge in a book by that name. This division between discursive sites and material sites perhaps leads Foucault into a contradiction himself. He says, that is, that sites are not superimposable. For him, a site can be reduced to another site. There can be no two sites in one place, no two things in one space. And we'll return to that notion. For him, there can be no two things in one place. Sounds reasonable, actually, right? It is true in the same essay, he thinks more experimentally about a certain place called heterotopia, within which superimposition seems at least conceivable, or at the very least given to spatial experience. So maybe you can have multiple things in one place. His example is the theater, in which an audience encounters a variety of superimpositions, or in his words, superimposed meanings. That is, playgoers bring together various spatial conceptions. For example, the sensation of being in a brick and mortar theater house, or just being in a room. The experience of the imagined space, that is the stage, and the various scenes, one after another, produced with a simple modification of lighting, or the hanging of a drape, or the introduction of a stage prop, and so forth. All matters that Bertolt Brecht himself understood well, by the way. In talking about spatial meanings here, however, Foucault encounters a limit in just how a heterotopia may be more than imaginary, to cite Huysen's incomplete formulation, more than just matters of meaning and imagination. Foucault forecloses the possibility of a heterotopia as actually existing in the built environment, that is, as a materiality unto itself. Okay, so what comes after Foucault, right? Hegel. So this section is called Hegel. So leave it to the idealist Hegel to do the work of a materialist in conceptualizing place as a site of superimposition, place as the location of a materiality at odds with itself in its multiplicity. How does Hegel come to this conclusion? The answer begins with understanding that Hegel sought to recuperate the philosophical category of contradiction, to bring it back to philosophy after centuries of thinkers expunging it from the philosophical process up to and including Immanuel Kant. Hegel instead wanted to state that contradiction constitutes not only our habits of thought and perception, but as well our modes of being in the world, even the feeling of life, especially in moments of pain. Quote, contradiction cannot be thought, Hegel writes in The Science of Logic, but in the pain of the living being, contradiction is an actual concrete existence, unquote. Contradiction and pain, contradiction and embodiment. So contradiction already isn't only for thinking, it's for feeling, it's for embodiment by the living being. Contradiction, as Hegel poses it here, is already actual, already concrete, concrete, which is a term referring not to cement, but to the idea that what is whole, complete, and total is nonetheless riven with differences, which, to come full circle, such an idea of an existent or material contradiction already expresses. So we're getting to this notion of a material contradiction, not a temporal contradiction, but a material one that constitutes, I don't know, a philosophy of nature. It helps to sort of follow Hegel and what he writes after the phenomenology of spirit, namely the science of logic, as we already had seen, and then a little later on, his philosophy of nature. The new developments in these texts are that contradiction, and these are basically his words. I know I keep saying, you know, just because you say it doesn't make it so. I'm saying what Hegel says, and then we can talk about what that means. But Hegel says that contradiction is real, actual, and existent, such that it can be said that in a fundamental way, contradiction constitutes the material environment, not only in the buildings we build, as in my opening to this paper, but that contradiction is a feature of matter itself, rife with difference, before we even seek to shape matter into a second nature through our labor. But what I have said here isn't really the hard part. This might be a good time to go to the bathroom or take a nap, and then I'll pound the table when it's time to wake up and follow along. Rather, the difficulty comes in a series of formulations where Hegel more than ever flouts the laws of logic, the very principles of philosophy since Aristotle, and boldly Hegel says that two things or more can be in the same place at the same time. This logical oddity, which supplies a new jolt to the very idea of contradiction, which now is such a boring word, we need to get the feeling back. You know what I mean? Contradiction needs to mean something. It needs to be made astonishing. It needs to give us pause. It needs to make us tarry, to slow down time, to stop in the moment of immediacy long enough to apprehend mediation, long enough to study the mediate in its emergence. Yes, this logical peculiarity is expressed in his treatment of matter. And a few points here before giving you just one of the many instances. So for Hegel, matter has a peculiar spatiality. Hegel finds that the quality of elasticity, above all, captures the spatial peculiarities of matter, and lacking later knowledge about electron fields and repulsive forces at the atomic level, he is nonetheless intrigued by instances when objects are microscopically in contact with one another, with varying degrees of force and pressure. In most cases, objects bend and flex in contact with each other, and objects accordingly revert to their ideal shape. You know, there we go. Revert to their ideal shape when the contact force or pressure ends, much in the way a pillow made out of that memory foam, you know, that much like one of those pillows bounces back into shape when you raise your head from the pillow. Elasticity runs the range of tensions and of course has limits until things break. But it's in this thought of the volume dynamics of matter, that Hegel offers his strange and shocking idea in the philosophy of nature. He says that the elasticity of which all matter partakes activates a simultaneity within matter itself that keeps matter together, that helps an object remain cohesive, keeping it whole by the force of the paradoxical unity of parts. And this is that quotation. It's the one that says on the sheet, two material parts which formerly persisted as outside of each other and which must therefore be conceived as occupying different places in the object, now occupy one and the same place. This is the contradiction, and it exists here in a material form. So that's crazy talk, but this is the philosophy of nature, and I guess that's where you do your crazy talking. We finally find asymmetry, in other words, finally find symmetry, fusion, a convergence of two material parts at the heart of matter that consequently reverberates asymmetry up the material order in the way some things break and some things fall apart. You may wonder why Hegel speaks only of two material parts in one place. Very, very pressing matter, right? The limit should be addressed, the limit of two, only because in the foregoing analysis of novels and built spaces, we had been looking at the plurality of place as containing many parts, many determinations, many properties, many inertias, and many praxes. So why just two? Hegel speaks of the two that are in one in the same place because he aims to contest the iron law that is the principle of non-contradiction, which has been used over the millennia to say that two things cannot be in the same place at the same time. This law of non-contradiction has long been associated with Aristotle, who in his Metaphysics asserts, quote, this is not on the handout, the most certain of all basic principles is that contradictory statements are not at the same time true. In other words, you can't say A is B and A is not B, with both being true at the same time. But Hegel is doing exactly that in his formulations, especially in a curious one in the science of logic, which we won't look at. Hegel said pshaw to all of these laws of logic to give us a sense of a more disordered, even if dialectical world. Thank you for that. I have my person to focus on. So a final takeaway here is that Hegel, in my view, does all this rethinking not to only intensify the notion of contradiction, extending it from thought to matter itself, but to redefine the very meaning of place itself. This is all in the name of defining what is place, right? And this is all also a way of engaging in Aristotle, who only wanted to think of space in relationship to place. Place is the common term in all of Hegel's discussion of spatial paradoxes and material contradictions, and he has many of them, sororities, paradoxes involving the field that at one point is a field, but now it's a forest because it has one extra tree. Or, the man who is bald because he lost that last hair and is now bald. I can't remember how long ago that was, but it's been a while. But those kinds of things, these sort of spatial paradoxes that are about places, sites, fields, and such like. Place is that common term. And it matters in that place can contain the contradictions of place or of matter itself and hold multiple determinations together, even if contradiction is beneath our notice or doesn't immediately enter our thoughts as we look upon the world. Indeed, the only thing that you can say in advance about place is that it is contradictory, which means, and Hegel realizes this, that picking out a place and thinking of it in singular, easily definable terms is an impossibility, both philosophically and practically. So in other words, anyone who is saying that place is not multiply determined, that place does not have more than two things in one place, that person is the one who's being illogical, right? So that's how he wants to have it. And I find that a very useful formulation for thinking about the built environment and of thinking about what we might call a dialectic of space. So let's see where this goes. I'm making some cuts here because I want to get to Marx. Let's see where it goes. I would claim then this formulation that Hegel is a founder of dialectical materialism, and I know that other of my friends have done this, but I don't like their formulation, and I like mine better. But that was a very academic and well-supported argument. See, that's how you make a philosophical demonstration. You just say, you know, screw Slavoj. Are you getting that at home? Anyway. Hegel was the founder of a kind of dialectical materialism, something like a science of the dialectic that dares venture into the philosophies of nature as much as the philosophies of history. It's odd, namely, because that distinction goes to Marx, or at least to his reception across the decades after his death, beginning with Engels and his work, The Dialectics of Nature, which my professors always told me, don't read that. And it's like, okay, it's like, are you over 18? Click, you know, I mean, it's just the... I'm clicking. I'm going in. But credit can still go to Marx retrospectively, even if we appreciate just what Marx got from Hegel on this theme of spatial paradox, which is, I suggest, that Marx made the Hegelian notion of material contradiction of two things being in the same place into a central idea of his theory of the commodity. Readers may remember that Marx says that the commodity is a twofold thing, a use value and an exchange value. And I argue that he challenges us to think this twofold thing as two bodies in one place, that is, within one extension. And any readers who suffered through my previous book, The Birth of Theory, can find my argument there that this twofold thing, this strange contradiction that is the commodity, is a material contradiction that is concealed in the English translations of use value and exchange value. So here again is another example of language not doing the work of space. It's just failed translation, but let's just blame language anyway, right? And this is these words I have on the handout. In Marx's own language, talking about the commodity, Warenkörper is the term for use value, or better, use body. And Wertkörper, or value body, or the embodiment of value, is the term for exchange value. Here is the twofold thing, then, where two bodies, or corpora, can exist in the same portion of space within the same extensio. It is true that the usual reading is to view use value as matter, as the thing that you can touch, and exchange value as an abstraction, so that there aren't any logical problems of two things occupying one space, and Aristotle is all happy in his grave. But Marx too frequently insists on congealed, substantialized, crystallized, materialized aspects of exchange value to permit us to adopt for very long that distinction between what's actual and what's abstract, what's real and what's ideal. In fact, it's what's actual and what's actual, and it's our problem to sort of deal with it, and the way we deal with it, and this is the explanation, is in fetishism. To the degree that the commodity is the emblem for capitalism writ large, explaining why Marx even begins Capital with an analysis of commodities in the first place, its material contradiction after Hegel must be understood to represent, or indeed reflect, the spatial paradoxes, or indeed dialectical difficulty within the larger capitalist mode of production itself that would, as time would tell, envelop every way of life on the globe. And what does a commodity represent now in global capitalism but a multifold, multidimensional thing of many places, and the way in which its movement within the circuits of production and consumption, in other words, its circulation, is congealed within the commodity as if it were a monad that captures all far-flung relations together within itself. If the commodity is the sign for something, or a thing hewn from hard reality, it's this quality as a twofold thing whose substance is abstract labor spatialized over the globe. The commodity is a figure for spatial paradox as well as spatial abstraction, in that it obfuscates those circuits, territories, and vistas over which commodities must traverse to accrue value, the spaces over which they must travel, propelled by fossil fuels, to combine with other commodities in the assembly of durable or not so durable goods by the labor of modern low-wage work or even slaves. How far we want to go in this broad spatial conception of the commodity depends on how coextensive the place of our dwelling is within the space of the commodity, how comfortable we are with feeling commodified, with feeling objectified, how commodified in the broadest sense possible we feel we are, and how we feel our spatial conceptions are already the product of capital. Just what is the actual place of the commodity when it appears not to be delineated only by its own extension or objectness, its own thingliness in space, but rather projects itself, its space, it projects its space and takes within itself the spatialities of its own globalized mode of production. I mean, if you think about the thought of all the kind of the assembly of something like an iPhone, that's a product of Apple, which is an American company with products, you know, with materials that are mined from West Africa and assembled by Chinese laborers, either in West Africa or in China itself, and then the transportation of these devices, you know, in container ships, and just the kind of networks that bring these things together. You have to ask, where is a commodity? What is the kind of location of the commodity? Asking the question the other way around, not that it's in my hand, but something of the world of production is within the thing itself. Now, this problem of the twofold commodity calls for a new discipline called doppel-urbanology. So before I define that crazy Germano-Greek English word, which is not mine, let's pick back up with Murakami's 1984 and Aomami in the city again, when she's leaving the cab to descend the scarily difficult stairs to make it to street level. Okay, this is one of the quotations. There is always, as I said, one reality, the cab driver repeated slowly, as if underlining an important passage in a book. Of course, Aomami said. He was right. A physical object could only be in one place at a time. Einstein proved that. Reality was utterly cool-headed and utterly lonely. Okay, me again. If an object could only be at one place in one time, well, so much for that tried and true thesis after Aomami finishes her job, her hit job. She's a hit person, a hit woman. And she took out a one Mr. Miyama, who's now slumped dead over his desk. And here's what she says and thinks to herself. She could hear her heart beating. And in her head, in time with the beat, resounded the opening fanfare of Janecek's Sinfonietta. Soft, silent breezes played across the green meadows of Bohemia. She was aware that she had become split in two. Half of her continued to press the dead man's neck with utter coolness. The other half was filled with fear. She wanted to drop everything and get out of this room now. I am here, but I'm not here. I'm in two places at once. It goes against Einstein's theorem, but what the hell? Call it the Zen of the killer. So she becomes displaced and transported by music, or music in her head, taking her to the green meadows of Bohemia. And in this cut, this take from one kind of self-presencing to another, we are presented with a narrative necessity or some unknown historical necessity to characterize one's position in the world this way. Indeed, to personify it in such a fashion that the paradoxes of place become the conflicts and hesitations of a character itself. I mean, just the point. I mean, you just murdered this man and you're talking about Einstein's theorem and the fact that you're in two places at one time. Again, I just wanted to ask the stupid question, who does that? I mean, honestly. However, I think there's a better contemporary novel that expresses the singular theme of being in two places at once, and that is the acclaimed book by China Miévelle called The City and the City. I mean, you can just hear the title is already kind of ganging up on it. The City and the City, oh God. Well, this is the doppel-urbanology, okay? The doubled study of the city. So no plot summary here. Let me just tell you about this strange place. The City and the City is set in the space of two cities somewhere along the coasts of the Black Sea that have two different cultures, two languages, two architectural styles, two cuisines, and two sartorial habits. One is Michel a rather depleted city, and the other is the hyper-affluent, gleaming glass city of Ulcoma that's seeing rapid development, yet is rich in archaeological history. Both very different cities are in the exact same place, like really, that's the point of the novel, comprising one urban location, two things in one space, but for the fact that the inhabitants are compelled by custom and by police forces to see their own city and to unsee the other city right before their very eyes. Practically speaking, this means at one corner, you're in one city, you step off the curb and you're in another city. This building is in one city, the next one is in another. Every demarcation is a border, and sometimes the borders themselves are crosshatchings, where you are now in two cities at the same time, here on the sidewalk, over there in the vestibule. Like you literally have to, you're always computing where you are. And who goes about in urban space like that? Well, yes, sometimes, but the constant thought of where am I, where am I, where am I, gives a very different sense to the idea of being there, or just to the idea of being at all, okay? It's a strange place. That's because the separation between the two cities is mostly phenomenological rather than physical, but it's that too, of course. You are only permitted to see your own city, and while you move through space, you have to actively unsee the other city and its citizens. You have to unhear its sounds and unsmell its smells. Can you unsmell? I mean, that's why they say once you ring the bell, that's it, right? And, you know, there's, I won't talk about smell, for, mercifully, right? It's a sort of awareness without acknowledgement, observing without noticing, and performance of inattention. You know the whole performance of not looking, just when you see a person you don't want to talk to on the street. Have you ever, you know, like I do it all the time at my job when I see a colleague and it's like, oh, you know, and I perform unseeing. It's a fun thing. It gets me to where I'm going. I want to give you a paragraph here that is really, really interesting, and I think it's on. It begins that evening, Achille. Okay, number 7. Thank you. So yeah, to the text. Here is what a construction like this. This is how you write being in the city in two places at once. That evening, Achille walked with me in that both cities. Like you just have to call up both cities. The sweep and curves of Ulcoman, Byzantine, a jut over and around the low Mittel, Continental, and Middle history brickwork of Miévelle, its bas-relief figures of scarfed women and bombardiers, Miévelle's steamed food and dark breads fugging with the hot smells of Ulcoma, colors of light and cloth around gray basalt tones, sounds now both abrupt, schwa, staccatoed, sinuous, and throaty swallowing. Being in both cities had gone from being in Miévelle and Ulcoma to being in a third place, that nowhere both, that breach. Don't worry about the breach. Just look at the sentence. Like, there's something wrong with this passage. This is the worst English I think I've ever read in my life. But I think that is the point. This is the point. You can't even say it. I've practiced this passage many times. I still can't read it out loud. I have the rest of the paper memorized. So that's what it's like to be in two places at once in a world where you're already in two places at once. And this is how the very idea of place in the first place can accommodate the philosophical or logical paradox involving the non-contradiction of identity, that when it comes to place, there's a place within place within place. That's what a place is. What's more, this is what it's like to write this contradiction into very chewy words. But to introduce another example of being in two places at once, and to use another medium to, again, to extend the sort of inquiry from other kinds of representation, such a contradiction can be visualized, as we see in the work of the artist and curator Shagayeg Sirus, who facilitated and produced works that aspire to put artists and viewers in two places at the same time, no matter how far apart they are on the globe. So one piece is called A Window to Tehran, in which Tehran and San Francisco Bay Area are drawn together by showing the sunrise in the former, Tehran, while the same sun sets on location in the Embark Gallery in San Francisco. If you can follow what I'm saying here, it's hard to kind of visualize, but it's quite an amazing idea. Cyrus says that with this work, she fought, quote, to get a sense of the compression of time-space by using technologies, unquote. There's a lot to say here, but for me, what's compelling about this work is that the natural indexing of time's flow, the sun setting into a time called night lasting hours, the sun rising to bring forth the long day, turns clock time into its true form, namely movement, experienced now as the apparent magnitude of light changing across the skies in two places at once as the planet spins on its axis as a single and total globality, in an effect that reduces the horizon, once that ever mysterious vanishing point at the end of the earth over which the sailing galleon ship spills, now into a knowable finitude, the horizon, no longer a figure for infinity, no longer for a figure for otherness, the horizon as, after all, just another city, just another place. Skipping some passages because I heard my bell ring and I want to, be merciful. There's other works of art that are like that. And kind of the point of some of this is to say, why are artists doing this now? Like, that's just the point. Like, why do you see it in novels? Why do you see it in video installations? Why do you see it in performances? Why do you see it in philosophical texts? I find that an interesting question, and I think it's this moment of now, very different from, Aristotelian certainties, and very different from certain miracles across religions of the world, of bilocation, of seeing a saint or a mystic figure in two places at the same time. Very, very different. That's kind of a splitting. I'm talking about a synthesis, okay? So lest we lose our theme of asymmetries, I quickly want to call to mind that passage portraying Tokyo, a passage whose elements were to take for granted in their surface composition, presented as pure appearance. So let's take the case of cities themselves and take the case of any former colonial city. So I'm now switching the frame and I'm going to a very, very different place. Take the so-called colonial architecture that survives in many post-colonial locations, okay? And what I'm doing just to kind of give the thesis statement, because I'm cutting paragraphs as I'm reading, is the question of unseeing, like just, and re-seeing, okay? The strategies of really kind of, I don't want to say reading the environment because that again reduces it to text. I want to talk about these kind of cognitive abilities that are suited to spatial engagement. So a colonial city, take the so-called colonial architecture that survives in many locations. Such colonial architectural style, and I'll get to an example here very soon, to the tourist can look colorful and charming in locations that are gussied up for spectators and travelers to come and enjoy themselves. But colonial constructions are truly a different kind of appearance. To put it bluntly, the appearance that is the architecture of terror and domination, especially the historic examples so many tourists visit in such places as Salvador City and Bahia, Brazil, with its administrative buildings. This seems to me like a problem of optics, of unseeing and then re-seeing. When these structures were built, indigenous people didn't look and don't look at these quaint seeming buildings in the same way the tourists do now. That is quite obvious, but it kind of is not at the same time in tourist industries and in UNESCO. I don't want to use the word ideology. Is that too strong? Is that fine? Thank you. And Nadia says it's okay, then it must be. Okay. Not to speak for anyone, and lest we be reminded, these buildings are impositions, military installations imposed by force on Native people and their land. They are the old pine log stockades of the old American Western, of a different style and material and in a different place. True, these buildings could have assumed any style if settlers other than the Portuguese landed on the coast of Brazil, but they'd still be colonial in their function. It just so happened that this particular colonial style is a hybrid of classical or Renaissance motifs that, no matter how much tourists love it, monumentalizes violence and makes aesthetics out of politics and politics out of aesthetics before Walter Benjamin ever insisted of this conflation in the first place. That is why I find it strange when you go to the UNESCO website, it celebrates Salvador City as, quote, the colonial city par excellence in the Brazilian Northeast, an eminent example of colonial Renaissance architecture. It's not just me, I hope, right? No, okay. That word, I mean, that word colonial here, and apparently unproblematically, reflects the theme, and I'm quoting here, the theme of world exploration. That is like, that's as real as it gets. The theme of just world exploration, honestly. And the UNESCO website even describes a multicultural past. Again, this kind of idea of different ethnicities getting together in this multicultural, like a Benetton ad or something that you see on a brochure. What? Rather than saying that all of this looks, by virtue of its style and its infrastructure, as a site of enslavement, suffering, murder, conquest, and disease. This is like a total disconnect. But more to that, I'm interested in, like, how did we get to unseeing, right? That's the ideological problem. Of course, everyone wants to be happy on vacation, which is why nobody invites me with them when they go traveling, when visiting such places, and they don't want to dwell on human horrors. But they can at least realize that they are looking at architecture in the wrong way, and they must be told that. This is because to interpret the built environment requires intense acts of unseeing. We should regard the built environment wherever we are, not as a pure appearance or a seamless infrastructure that you negotiate unthinkingly as you drive on an elevated highway, unaware of what's below, or in your peripheral vision as you move through place. No, rather, and here I am speaking mostly to US citizens in reflecting on the settler colonial state I call home, that we should develop, that we would do well to defamiliarize the built environment and look on it as a series of impositions like these, where everything seems out of place, where everything is estranged, where nothing belongs, where something as sure as day has been imposed on someone else, where sites of violence are underfoot or under tire. Okay, I'm gonna now give you the last section. It's on Frantz Fanon. I kind of need to do it. Okay, can we do it? Okay. All right, let's go. Right. Can you hear that? Did you hear that? Okay, good. Been practicing. These acts of unseeing, this concern with the sedimentation of history, finally, is one of the chief critical preoccupations of Frantz Fanon, whose engagement with dialectics was sustained over his entire writing career and ended with some powerful meditations on what a spatial material dialectic can look like in his book, Wretched of the Earth. 3 pages into this work, and Fanon is teaching us that you cannot talk about the colony or decolonization without talking about land, infrastructure, neighborhoods, and development, all the way up to what he calls major public works projects and nation building. He, in short, gives us the so-called infrastructural critique in post-colonial studies before it was ever named as such, as people are doing now, infrastructural critique. This is 1962. He was even doing it in 1952 in Black Skin, White Masks. There are many important passages to choose from in Wretched of the Earth, but I would point to here to a few in closing, in a gesture of exploring some of the more collective but practically utopian dimensions of a dialectic of space. To begin with, Fanon speaks of the built environment at some length and remarks that intentionally parrot, ventriloquize, utter the colonizer's voice speaking down to the colonized. He writes that, and here's one of the quotes. I don't know what number this is, but it's 10. The colonized sector at 8. Okay, 8. The colonized sector, or at least the quarters, the shantytown, the Medina, the reservation, is a disreputable place inhabited by disreputable people. Again, he's speaking from the perspective of the colonizer. Just wanted to put that out again. You are born anywhere, anyhow. You die anywhere from anything. It's a world with no space. People are piled one on top of the other. The shacks squeezed together tightly. The colonized sector is a famished sector, hungry for bread, meat, shoes, coal, and light. Our theme of the past sedimented into the built environment is here not yet visible, really, excluded for the terrible present of the colonized sector where there is no space, where the stacked sedimentation of history gives way to the inhumane verticality in the present, where people, as if dead or dying, are piled on top of one another, the shacks squeezed tightly together. Not even the Medina nor the Old Town is picked out for its historical significance, the deep histories of these places, in other words, because this history hasn't mattered yet. Though I have to admit that I secretly think that Fanon is referring to Le Corbusier's Plan Obis of 1933. Do you know this one? A plan for the city of Algiers, which included, among other things, leveling the Kasbah and adding new residential units in which workers were stacked on top of each other in efficient buildings, in addition to elevated highways and basically just bulldozing through the most deeply historical part of Algiers. At any rate, there is no sense of indigenous historicity because Fanon feels that indigenous pasts have themselves been colonized and sunk into the sediment by colonists and bourgeois intellectuals who hope that these traditions will remain inert, will stay in place, all the while fetishizing indigenous pasts as only a matter of style, of surface and veneer. Fanon writes, and here's the next quote, number 9. I can count now. The culture with which the intellectual is preoccupied is very often nothing but an inventory of particularisms. Seeking to cling close to the people, he clings merely to a visible veneer. This veneer, however, is merely a reflection of a dense subterranean life in perpetual renewal. Colonialism is not satisfied with snaring the people in its net or of draining the colonized brain of any form or substance. With a kind of perverted logic, it turns its attention to the past of the colonized people and distorts it, disfigures it, and destroys it. This effort to demean history prior to colonization today takes on a dialectical significance. So what is the so-called dialectical significance transpiring in Fanon's postulated today back then? It's that in decolonization, there is the aforementioned perpetual renewal. That is, that a certain dialectic is newly activated, whereby the arts are finally unfrozen and set in motion to take on new meanings to meet the revolutionary situation. Fanon writes, next quote, number 10, oral literature, tales, epics, and popular songs previously classified and frozen in time begin to change. Storytellers who recited inert episodes revive them and introduce increasingly fundamental changes. There are attempts to update battles and modernize the type of struggle the heroes' names and the weapons used. In artisanship, the congealed, petrified forms loosen up. Wood carving, for example, which turned out set faces and poses by the thousands, start to diversify. The expressionless or tormented mask comes to life. The arms are raised upwards in a gesture of action. And I love the sense of coming to life here, of a revivification. Now, to be sure, for Fanon, this praxis isn't only limited to art and what can be called representation in the fullest. And I simply have that passage because it's all forms of art. The multiplicity of media and representation itself is what you need. It's not just one thing. It's not novels. Novels aren't going to do it. Not only poetry is going to do it. What's going to do it? Praxis also involves a different kind of doing, and that for Fanon, that is nation building in a very real way, with attention to the construction of infrastructure in what I find to be one of the most compelling instances of the spatial dialectic in any work that I have seen. Fanon says that, quote, during the period of nation building, every citizen must continue in his daily purpose to embrace the nation as a whole, to embody the constantly dialectical truth of the nation, unquote. So the nation and the dialectic kind of are going together. It's a kind of nationalism that's interesting. And how is that done, according to him, right? It's not through thinking and saying things. It's not through slogans. It's through building and doing so realistically and flexibly so that history can be made, or better, materialized at the hands and in the hands of the people. This is the last quote, and now we're really about to break through the tape and be done. But Fanon writes, if the building of a bridge does not enrich the consciousness of those working on it, then don't build the bridge and let the citizens continue to swim across the river or use a ferry. The bridge must not be pitchforked or foisted upon the social landscape by a deus ex machina, but on the contrary must be the product of the citizens' brains and muscles. And there's no doubt architects and engineers, foreigners for the most part, will probably be needed, but the local party leaders must see to it that the techniques seep into the desert of the citizen's brain so that the bridge in its entirety and in every detail can be integrated, redesigned, and reappropriated. The citizen must appropriate the bridge. So everything is here. You have the idea that there must no longer be any imposition on the land, because that's exactly what colonial architecture already is, even though here that kind of architecture means social control, and there are books on architecture as social control, as you know. Instead, you have the practical role of architects and engineers who aren't highfalutin professionals swooping down on everyone to dictate what's what, which is the story of the invention of the discipline of architecture. Rather, the theorists are coming to town, like, oh God, like, where's the exit, right? Rather, architects are constrained and engineers are limited by local leaders to plan and design not only in the interest of the citizens, but with their help, they're gladly given labor. I find Fanon to be a great ending here in the sense that he is also a beginning, linking the ideas about what's sedimented in built environments as inherently contradictory spaces, inertial subterranean forces that have life and are, when we are mindful, resistant to our designs, and flexible to our needs. The project going forward are the kinds of poiesis, the kinds of making that are praxis for the people who wish to build their worlds. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for that tour de force.